All right, Mr. Fulford. Ding, 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 ding. It's time. Welcome to the education budget hearings. Chairman Garrett, any opening words of greetings?
We're ready to get going. So
All right.
Tell us the good news.
Yeah, good news. Good morning. I just want to let you know before I start, all of today's presentations are on our website in the same place that yesterday's presentations were. They're under news. In addition to that, and for some time later on, I wanted to let you know that our annual publications that we do, our tax guide, our tax expenditure report, as well as our budget fact book, will all also be on the website today. So lots of useful information out there if you want to use it. It should be out there, like I said, at some point in time later. I'm not sure what time, but all of the presentations are out there right now. So I wanted to start with economic conditions. Despite historically high U.S. inflation, the economy has been resilient to this point and not fallen into a deep recession. Lots of economists had predicted last year at this point in time that they would have gotten to that point, and it hasn't so far, although we've got an extremely tight labor market and inflation is still extremely elevated. Total non-farm employment that came out on Friday for January increased by 353,000. I'll get back to that in a minute because it's important when it gets to what the Fed plans to do. Unemployment rate was unchanged at 3.5%. Labor market participation at the U.S. level, 62.5%. That's still below pre-pandemic levels. Hourly earnings, and this would be universal across the board, for private non-farm employees increased 19 cents to $34.50 in January. And over the last 12 months, average hourly earnings we're up 4.5%, and again, that's an indication of the tight labor market and the increase in wages that have gone along with that. Real GDP, again, 2/3 of our economy is driven by consumer spending. I'll show you a chart in a minute that shows how elevated that has been over the past few years. That's generally what's driving us at this point and kind of what's been keeping us out of having a negative impact on the economy with regard to the inflation situation. So just a couple of charts about labor. The one on the right is the one I really wanted to focus on. This goes back to 2019 with regard to the number of unemployed people for every job opening. At the U.S. level, that number is 0.7. There's 0.7 unemployed people for every job that's open. That number in Alabama is 0.4, which indicates a lot of the angst and the focus on the labor market participation and the need to increase the number of people participating in our labor market. This is a chart that I was mentioning. Consumer spending going back to 2019 and forward has been growing at an astronomical rate. We also wanted to point out, if you wanted to know why, or part of the reason why there were lots of spending pressures put on during 2020 and after COVID, look at the gap between the spending rate and the savings rate. The savings rate actually exceeded the spending rate in 2020, simply because basically there were lots of federal money provided to individuals and businesses, and the economy was basically shut down for the most part. So people saved more of the money as opposed to spending it, but look at the trajectory of those lines afterwards. People are now saving at a rate lower than what they were pre-pandemic. And at the same time, they're spending at an elevated rate that is not keeping up with their growth in income. So I think there's been some reports recently regarding the growth in credit card debt. A lot of that's attributed to consumer spending. So this is the situation with the U.S. economy, inflation, right? We've focused on inflation for several years. Historic high inflation in 21 and 22. It came down a little in 23, but understand that that 3.4% level is still elevated above where the Federal Reserve would like that number to be, which is about 2%. That's just a month-to-month, year-to-year comparison that goes back to 2020. I just put it in there for my benefit. Really, I like to look at the line. So what has the federal government done, Federal Reserve done in response to inflation? Typically, they raise rates when the economy's overheating, we have too much inflation, and that's their response with monetary policy to try to slow the economy down. Unfortunately, they waited until after the first quarter in 2022 before they acted. If you see the first bullet on the right, they didn't start increasing the rates until the first quarter of 2022. Up until that point, the rate was still basically zero. And since that time, the rate has been increased by 525 basis points. For context, what that is 5.25% since that time. That's a big increase over a 2-year period. In fact, that elevation and increased rates is at a higher pace than ever, even back during the 70s and 80s. So once they began to act, they acted very fast. So their stated goal in trying to do changes in monetary policy is to return inflation to a consistent basis of 2%. They may revisit that at some point in time in the future, but again, 3.4% is still not there. They had a report that came out last week. They met, and their press release said that they think they've made gains in the job market. They think they've made gains on reducing inflation, but inflation is still elevated, not where they want it to be, and the economic outlook is uncertain. And so they decided that it wouldn't be wise for them to reduce interest rates at that point in time, and not likely to do so until June. That's really important to me because I waited to finalize my general fund revenue estimates until Friday after this came out, because I was waiting to hear that. And the reason I waited, I'll show you in a minute when we start looking at the general fund. This is a major issue with regard to the general fund in this year and the next couple of years. Chairman Powell stated earlier that they intend to reduce rates in 2024 by 3/4 of 75 basis points total. And that's really important because he also stated that going forward, they also intend to return the rates back down to the 2022 level, which would be close to zero. And that will have a dynamic impact on the general fund. That and the fact that you're spending a lot of the excess federal money that you're holding on to in the Treasury now that you're able to draw interest from. For context, in 2020, the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates by 150 basis points at one time in March of 2020. Over that last 6 months of the fiscal year, our interest on state deposits that went to the general fund declined by 46%. That was at a time when they only had invested about $4.5 billion. They've got about $12 billion invested now. So small, modest decreases are going to have a major impact on that line in the general fund. Alabama's no different. We've got a tight labor market. Our unemployment situation is very good. But again, we have the same situation that the U.S. has with regard to labor market participation. You've got several different groups that are looking at that issue. And it's a good thing because increasing that is a really good way to increase the number of people out there that you can have a certificate that can fill some of the job openings.
Mr. Fulford, can I ask you, go back, a question related to that? Very early in your presentation, and tell me if I got this wrong, I wrote down, you said there were 0.7 job for U.S. and then 0.4 for Alabama. Can you go over those?
Yeah, those are from October, the last numbers that I've got on that. Those were the number of unemployed people per job opening. So less than.
So it's higher for the nation than it is in Alabama?
Yeah, the nation's actually higher than Alabama. So in other words,
there are more job openings on the national scale than there are.
We've got 59,000 unemployed people to fill a large number of job openings that we have, which is also an indication of how tight our labor market is, and the angst and focus on increasing that labor market participation.
Not to get you off track, but if it's higher nationally, we wring our hands about workforce participation right here in the state. But what you're saying, there are fewer jobs, open jobs available here in Alabama than there is in the national level. Is that right?
Well, in
Or am I
relationship,
missing
I'm
it?
saying there's fewer unemployed people that could fill those openings.
Okay.
Well, that's the question. So the unemployment rate and labor participation rate are two different pools. So when you say that 0.4, that to me seemed like Alabama numbers should have been higher than this federal, but although we have a lower unemployment rate, we also have a lower labor participation rate.
Right.
So like you're saying we're 57.2%, the national 60.2%.
62 and a half.
Okay, 62.5, so we're 5% below labor participation. So I still don't understand what that 0.4, 0.7, is that just the unemployment pool,
That's the unemployment pool.
which
right.
is not the labor participation pool?
Right, that could fill those vacant openings.
But that's not the, but still we're 5 points below the national labor participation rate.
Yeah, I'm just giving you the national data. I'll have to dig into it to see what the rationale behind it is, or if there's an explanation that's,
I mean, when I saw that 0.4 to 0.7, it looked like Alabama was better than the national average. That's what it's out there. But then you look at this labor participation rate, we're way behind and we're worse.
right. Yeah, I'll get more information on that for you if you want me to. Again, Alabama's economy is doing well. We have had historic returns on both of our budgets and revenues over the past couple of years. A lot of that can be explained from the federal assistance that come in. The increase, the low unemployment means there's more people, there's a lot of people out there working, and because of the tight labor market, the salaries have been elevated, which means our withholdings taxes have been increased over the last couple of years. I'll show you a chart on that. I think this was in line to what Chairman Garrett was pointing to, pre-pandemic unemployment rates and workforce participation versus now. We improved the last report that we got in our workforce participation, but obviously still below where we were before the pandemic.
So just my understanding is the unemployment rate is a function of the people who are out of work who are looking for work.
Yes,
Labor participation are people who are out of work who are not looking for work.
that's right. Those that could be in the labor pool but are not for whatever reason.
Right.
Does that number also include the unemployed who are looking for work?
No, they're in the unemployed number.
Two separate numbers, there's no
Two
overlap.
separate numbers. There's a different batch of people that could be in the workforce, but they're not, versus those that are counted as in the workforce, but they're unemployed and looking for work.
So my understanding is there's like maybe 4,000, 3,000 unemployed people that are looking for work, and there's like 59,000 people who are not working, who are not looking for work.
That's right. And for various reasons. I mean, I think there's different reports that give reasons about why that is.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Chandler.
one question about the labor participation rate. Are there any exclusions or any accounting of those spouses that choose to stay at home with their children and that kind of thing, or is that not considered at all?
I don't think that's part of the equation. I think
personally, I think
they're in the could be, but not.
Yeah, I think that should be a consideration, because we as a state, I think, choose to do that more than maybe some other states. But anyway, I just wanted to know if that was accounted for.
Understood. So this is a review of 23. I want to hit this real important part. What I mentioned earlier about the interest on state deposits is an extremely important thing for the general fund. In 2023, interest on state deposits accounted for $364 million out of $461 million in growth. Double-digit growth. Everybody's happy. That revenue source concerns me greatly because of all the things that I just mentioned with regard to the rates and how they're going to change over the next couple of years. I went back as far as the mid-90s. We've never had a triple-digit figure in interest on state deposits. So we go from $40 million in 22 to $404 million. Again, that's a direct reflection of the amount of money that we have on deposits and the interest rates that we're receiving on that money. It's a good thing for the bottom line, but it cannot be continued to count it on an ongoing basis because it's going to go the opposite direction really soon. And when you do the side-by-side comparisons over years, it's going to show a negative growth. We don't have $360 million in growth in the other 40 revenue sources of the general fund. So projections are going to be declining because of that. And you know, changing administration, maybe the Federal Reserve changes their course altogether and they do bigger cuts as opposed to smaller cuts. And so there's all of that that has to be considered when we're looking at the interest on state deposits. Condition of the fund, we ended the year with a $717 million ending balance. $223 million of that was from the reversions. I think that's important to know because that's an ongoing thing. It's reverted money that turns around and gets reappropriated. It counts toward the bottom line in the succeeding year, but it's a negative adjustment in the year that ended. What's really important to note is of that $717 million, roughly 361 of that's already been allocated. 215 million, again, gets reappropriated to the agencies. There were several conditionals that were also released. Those were in the budget, and when the conditions were met, the funds were released. So 361 out of that 716 has already been accounted for. Education Trust Fund, again, exponential growth in 21 and 22, flattened out in 23. Wasn't really surprising to me, simply because if you go back and look at the history of that, you can see that what happened in 21 and 22 was just unsustainable and historic highs that unprecedented. So flat revenues, income tax, net income tax was down 150. A lot of that was related to an increase in refund payments of about $260 million. The other part of that is income tax comes in 4 components. 3 of those components are estimated payments, S-corp payments, and payments with returns. All of those had historic increases in 21 and 22, and they turned the opposite direction in 23. They right-sided themselves. And so everything we were picking up on withholdings taxes, because withholdings tax should go up, right? We've got low unemployment and high wages, and so you ought to have more money coming in. Well, that you did. But all of that growth was offset by the decline in the other 3 components of income tax. And this is a chart that just indicates exactly what I said. The growth in 21 and 22 is absolutely out of line. 30% growth in 22. This is real numbers. This is backed out all of the noise or one-time adjustments. So 8% and 30%, and then we flatten back out. So not necessarily unsurprising. Average growth over that same period from 2002 forward is 4.6%. So that dashed line through the center of the page actually reflects the average point for all the revenues to the ETF. I wanted to point this out too. The drivers of ETF revenues are income and sales. The gross sales tax in 2021 increased by almost 15%. It's never increased by 15%. The previous year, or the 22, it increased by over 7%. 23, it got back down to 3.8%, which if you look is not far off from what the average growth is. Gross income tax, individual, 22 was up 22%. You don't see a percentage adjustment anywhere close to that historically. And then withholdings payments, what I was referring to. In 22, there was an increase of almost 10.5%. There's not been a 10.5% increase in withholdings payments going back for 30 years. I could take that out even further. So in other words, lots of increases, lots of unprecedented increases, and certainly some increases that were out of normal. And so moderating back down to some sort of an average that gets closer to that normal rate is not surprising to me. Wanted to point this out. These are appropriations. This condition of the fund is an end of the general fund. I think there's been several reports about that bottom line number that have been misinformed. And unfortunately incorrect. Let me correct it for you. Yes, the ending balance in the ETF was $2.5 billion. No, you don't have to deal with $2.5 billion. You already dealt with most of it. Here's how. So out of that $2.5 billion, you passed changes to the Rolling Reserve Act during last session that dealt with almost all of it. Roughly $9 billion of that has already been allocated to the Budget Stabilization Fund, to the new reserve fund that you established, and to the Advancement and Technology Fund. The absolute maximum remaining that you could do a supplemental appropriation bill, absent you doing some other changes, is $651 million. Certainly not $2.5 billion. Right? You already addressed that last year. Highlight again, these are appropriations as you enacted them. They do not include supplemental appropriations. They do not include conditional appropriations. Those things happen again after the budget kicks in and into the next fiscal year. You heard from them yesterday. Medicaid, corrections, mental health, DHR are pretty much, and your judicial system are pretty much your drivers of general fund appropriations. They all requested pretty substantial increases from the general fund. There's your allocation of the baseline ETF appropriations, the split on that, 72.6 and 27.3. And that's historically, it's been close to that over the last several years. So what's our outlook? Again, Kirk's extremely concerned about that interest on state deposits number. So for the current fiscal year, and again, I had more time to look at this than the people across the street, and I debated and kicked myself and fought myself over it for a while. But our revenue estimates for the general fund for 2024, because again, before you can do 25, you have to revise 24. 24 is basically flat. Now, you're looking at the returns for the year to date, and we're up 7.5%. Well, why, Kurt? Why? Well, it's that interest on state deposits number that's going to change. And if I could tell you exactly, I knew the timing on that, if I knew exactly how much money we'd have in the bank at the point in time they changed interest rates, I could give you a better indication of what kind of impact that would possibly have. So the 24 estimate is pretty flat. The 25 estimate's actually negative for the same reason. We don't have $150 million in revenue growth in the 40 other revenue sources to be able to replace that kind of an impact on interest on state deposits in 2025. Now, it's important to know, and I'll show you in a minute. So if you pulled the interest on state deposits out completely, last year revenue growth was $97 million. That's about 3.3%. That's lower than average growth in the general fund for the last 20 years. Average growth is about 3.6%. If you do that for the current fiscal year, is 2.3%. Everything else is growing by combined 2.3% if you discount interest on state deposits. Well, what does that mean? That means if you're not spending at a clip below a 2.3% growth, then you're eating into your leftovers and you're possibly setting yourself up in a situation that can't be sustained on a long-term basis. So again, that's our revenue estimates. That's our estimates of what you might do in terms of supplemental appropriations, simply based on what you did last year was a similar amount. So again, I'm really anxious about that estimated bottom line. Again, our revenue estimates are a little higher, I know, than some others, but with the people that we talk to, the economists that we talk to and get guidance from, our estimates are kind of in between the high and the low. So I think all in all, they're fairly decent in terms of what the bottom line looks like. Again, there it is. Year to date up 7.5%. But again, all of that, more than all of it, is interest on state deposits. Just keep that in mind. I can't say that enough because it's been keeping me up at night lately. So interest on state deposits, the ETF outlook for 24 and 25. Not the same situation, but certainly in good shape. So Education Trust Fund growth. Oh, let me get back to this. Really wanted to point out, even if we have zero growth for the rest of the year, the general fund is in great shape, right? if you had received the same amount last year, and I've already told you why that probably won't happen, that you received, if you received the same amount this year than you did last year, you're still well above what you need to support expenditures up until this point. That's before you do any additional supplemental appropriations. Education Trust Fund, similar situation, in great shape to cover your expenses. But the revenue situation is a little murky right now, and here's why. You passed a bill last year to reduce the sales tax on food. I congratulate you for doing that. I've been here long enough to see many efforts at doing that, and they never got to the point that you did. So congratulations on doing that. But if you're looking at a side-by-side comparison, you reduced the base in this year versus last year. So the growth comparisons are going to be negative simply for that reason. Year-to-date growth in sales tax is down 33%. Some of that, not all of it, but some of it is directly related to that sales tax on food comparison. Income tax is up only slightly. Again, still working through some of that excess of those three-part components of the previous year's withholdings is still going great.
Excuse me, Kurt, you said sales tax was down 33%. You meant 33 million.
$33 million, $33 million, negative 4%. That's the net. It's actually 4.75% on the gross. I'm sorry about that. But again, bottom line is, budget's in great shape. Even if you had zero growth for the rest of the year, even if you dropped off $500 million, in other words, there's a gap between what you're spending versus what you're getting, and that's an ideal situation every year. Now, it also doesn't mean that you can go spend that. The provisions of the Rolling Reserve Act won't let you do that. So it's one of the good things about the Rolling Reserve Act. Again, back to Rolling Reserve Act, you know what it did. You passed, in 2011 it was passed, you originally had a fiscal year appropriation cap that tied increase in spending to a formula that was based on the prior year's receipts that were adjusted by an average growth rate over 15 years, dropping the low year. You allowed the expenditures to also be limited by the average of the estimated revenues if the cap number was above the estimated revenues. Also created a budget stabilization fund and an advancement in technology fund. And congratulations, I didn't put the history on this, but prior to 2011, for 4 consecutive fiscal years, the education budget was in proration. So that was part of the reason why everyone was interested in doing something about it, and the Rolling Reserve Act was the something. And since that point in time, there's been no proration, so that's great. What did you do last year? So recognizing those accelerated past couple of years that were really outside of your control, driven a lot by enhanced federal assistance that came into the state, it created a different funding formula. We still do the cap calculation, but you drop in the high year from the cap as well as the low year. But expenditures now can only be either the cap number or the lesser of that and a secondary spending limit, which is based on a percentage growth in the previous year's appropriations. For 2025, that number is 6.25%. I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. And you also created an Educational Opportunities Reserve Fund. I think that's really critical, and a lot of people gave you flack for that. I won't. I think it was a good thing for you to do, and here's why. You do have 2 other reserve funds for the Education Trust Fund. One's a rainy day account in the Constitution within the Alabama Trust Fund. That money can only be accessed in the event the education budget falls into proration, nothing else. And you have to pay that back within 6 years. The other one being the Budget Stabilization Fund, which is a liquid fund, but it also could only be accessed in the event you had a proration situation. If revenues flattened out, if revenues declined but didn't get to a point of being in a proration situation, you couldn't do anything. You just had to absorb it and keep going. You now have the ability to be able to address that. And oh, by the way, because it's a liquid reserve fund and there are not the caveats in terms of it has to be in a proration situation, these people that like to gauge where Alabama stands in terms of having reserves, they look at that very favorably. So I expect that some of those publications will increase our ranking in that standard in going years. So I also changed the overflow. Showed you earlier where that went at the end of 23. Budget Stabilization Fund, 1% of the previous year's appropriation, still going to put money in there until it hits a 10% balance of the previous year. Advancement and Technology Fund gets 50% of the remaining excess, up to $1 billion, and the new reserve fund gets 20% of what's left. So that Advancement and Technology Fund, because of the changes, you're going to be able to deposit an additional $1 billion on top of the 750 that was already in there. So available balance is $1.75 billion. This slide shows you what the money can be used for. It does include capital outlay, does include school security measures. That money can only be split between K-12 and higher ed. There are no other functions that can come into the calculation. It's simply part of that two-part split. Your new reserve fund, you can also access that through a supplemental appropriation bill. You can offset reductions in revenue, as I mentioned. You also can address some unanticipated obligations. Those pop up from time to time. School burned down, a tornado, those kind of situations. To sustain programmatic increases, what do you mean by that? Well, you've made serious investments in K-12 and other functions of education over the last few years. Teams, literacy, numeracy, all of those require programmatic increases every year to sustain where you are. If you got into a situation where money was tight and you couldn't increase it by 5, you couldn't increase it by 10 like it's supposed to, you could access this reserve fund to make sure that you stayed on course and didn't go backwards. To maintain prior appropriation levels and for startup support for initiatives that change education. Don't really know what those are at the moment, but at some point in time, we'll probably address that. Initial balance, you appropriated $353 million in it. That does not include the $412 million that's going in there in the next month or so. So now for 25, beginning 25, so how are you determining what you can spend? As I mentioned, we're doing the cap calculation or the secondary spending limit is the lesser of the two, and that tells you the most you can spend in the ETF budget for 2025. Here's what that looks like. The cap figure for 2025 was $10.7 billion. The secondary spending limit is 9.3, so you can only spend 9.3, but that gives you the ability to increase spending in the 2025 budget above the 2024 budget, almost $550 million. Historically, $550 million is a large increase on a year-to-year basis. It's been several years, but there were a few years back that we didn't even approach $100 million. So $550 million is huge.
Kurt, just to clarify, that 550 is the budget portion, but we also have, like you said, 1.75 billion of A&T money that we will supplementally appropriate.
Absolutely.
This is part of that, not all of that this year, but that's not included in this number.
Yeah, you've got lots of, that number also does not include that 651. If you decided to do something on a supplemental, it doesn't include the advancement and technology money. It just includes the 2025 budget that starts October. And then the main document that you'll be working on during the session. So what's our condition of the education budget for 25? Again, revenue estimates are included here. There's our projections as far as ending balance for what that means. Looking at another year of pretty flat growth in the education. A lot of things into that, but some of that's related to the leveling out or going down or decreasing sales tax, and also there's an anticipation that consumer spending is going to decline in the coming couple of years simply because the wage increases are not going to be as elevated as they have been. Some of that's going to flatten out, and hopefully the inflation figures will come down, so that'll also flatten out consumer spending or the gross sales tax figures. So there's what we project to be the ending balance with regard to that, and how the Rolling Reserve Act takes care of a lot of that going into 2025. For context, the growth rate that we're estimated for 24 is roughly 0.6%. Going into 25, it's a little less than 2%. And again, those numbers are within the realm of our economists that we talk to and we get advice from. They're not the economist estimates. Those are the LSA estimates that we certify and will certify today. So the sales tax on food, you did a lot on sales tax on food. Again, There was no definition of food in the statute. There was no separate rate on food. It was subject to the general 4% rate. Local taxes, because of a local tax simplification issue, had to have the same base as the state, so they didn't really have an option of being able to lower the rate on their own. You fixed all of that at one time. You defined food as the same for SNAP benefits. You created a separate tax rate on food. Initially at 4%, you reduced it to 3%, as I mentioned, October the 1st. It was September the 1st, actually, collections in October. And the tax rate could be further reduced to 2% this upcoming September if the average of the estimated revenues certified by myself and the finance director are above 3.5%. I just told you our revenue estimates are a little less than 2%. So unless his estimates are over 5%, that trigger is not going to be met for fiscal year 2025, but it doesn't mean you don't have a chance to reduce it. It means it just doesn't happen in fiscal 25. It can happen at another fiscal year into the future when the revenue estimates are greater than 3.5%. Last thing I wanted to mention to you, and I hope I was clear enough on this, one of the main things that you're going to have to worry about this session is managing expectations. There are expectations that revenue growth will continue to be at an astronomical rate. That certainly is not the case. For context, and this is kind of surprising, but you saw the agency funding request yesterday. I mentioned some of those over on the right-hand side. But the entirety of the education community requested increases of about $1.24 billion. You only got $550 million that you can spend in 2025. So I think some of that was related to their anticipation of what the ending balance would be and trying to, but that has nothing to do with this. Two separate things altogether. I also want to caution you. You're the policymakers. You make policy, and you'll decide what's important to you and what you want to pass. Every year we seem to see lots and lots of credits and deductions and exemption bills that come up, and if that's something that you want to pursue, you absolutely have the capacity to do that. My warning on that is make sure it's something you want to do, because if you do it and pass it, we have to cut spending to account for that. That's how the Rolling Reserve Act works. If it's a credit, it's a reduction on the bottom line of the succeeding year. It also reduces the amount of money that you've got available for everything else. So, and that, and the fact that there are other states, I talked to people in my similar job in other states, there are several other states have gotten themselves in horrible trouble by doing too many credits and deductions and things of that nature and reducing their bottom line to the point that they couldn't support their ongoing operations. So that's my warning on that. Take it for what it's worth. I do have a serious concern, and I'll say it again, expiring federal funds and what that does to you in terms of request. My main issue there is the K-12 federal funding and how it went, the obligation date extended. But when that money runs out, they're going to come ask you to replace it with state money. You're only going to have $600 million in capacity each year going forward. You can't actually replace $3 billion in federal money. It's certainly not there for you to do it with, while at the same time that you're trying to do pay raises and benefit increases and other things that you have to do just to basically keep the lights on. So that's a concern for me. You already saw it yesterday. I think Commissioner Buckner discussed that with regard to some of the child care program. So again, keep that in mind. Benefit increases, it will be, if you haven't been approached yet, you will be about the SEIB request versus what may or may not be in the budget. They've asked for $1,026 per month, and current year is $977. That's an increase to the bottom line that a portion of that's covered by the general fund. There's also the annual issue with regard to do you do COLAs, don't you do COLAs? And again, certainly in your realm to do or don't do that. Commissioner Ham spoke yesterday, and I don't think it's a secret to anybody, hey, we're building 2 prisons. Those prisons are costing a lot of money. And eventually you're going to have to set aside money, additional money, to be able to cover some of those additional costs. So be wary of that. And also, I know everybody's seen what's going on in the back parking lot. We kind of need to take some money and set aside and deal with some of that too. Again, you all saw the major funding request from yesterday, $92 million for Medicaid. That's not an expansion situation. That's not a we want to do this new program situation. That's pretty much keeping the lights on and running the program. There's inflationary increases that she has every year that are outside of her control. CHIP, public health is increasing. Just the corrections inmate care is an additional $25 million, but their full request there was about $100 million, so that's only part of it. And human resources and others, and Representative Reynolds has been working with the Opioid Commission to come up with a plan to spend opioid settlement monies. We currently have about $30 million in the bank with the expectation to get millions and millions of more money in the next few years from the settlement of some of those cases. So there'll be most likely a supplemental appropriation bill as well as a bill to do some sort of plan so you can outline what you want to do with that going forward. The last issue there, slowing revenue projections, I hope I've indicated that I'm really concerned about that, especially on the general fund side. I think the education trust fund side will moderate itself. This 1-year hit on sales taxes, when you look at next year, that base will already be reduced. So now we're just talking about comparing the two, as opposed to comparing one with a lower base than the next year. So I expect that situation to change a little next year with positive growth. Certainly not anywhere near the 7, 8, 9% growth that we saw in 21 and 22. That's all I have. I just wanted to congratulate you, actually. You've done a phenomenal job over the last few years, number one, managing those expectations. Number two, making wise decisions and wise investments with the money you've been given to allocate. There are other states that are not in a similar situation. I can point you to a handful of those that have already had to cut their budget this year because of things that they hadn't anticipated, because of investments they made that didn't pan out. And you deserve some credit for managing the expectations and keeping us in great situation with regard to our budgets over the past few years and hopefully going forward as well. So that's all I've got. I know I threw a lot at you. If you have any questions, be glad to answer those.
Mr. Fulford, could you, on the education side, define a little bit in dollars and terms the loss of federal funds that we're looking at maybe in the 26 cycle, or do you have a feel for that, as far as the drop-off you'll see on the education side?
To the extent that, I haven't looked in the past few weeks, but they received about $3.1 billion total from the various opioid and COVID response actions. I think the last numbers I looked at, they were around 60% in terms of expending that $3.1 billion. So they've got a little time and they've got a lot of spending to do. My concern about that 3.1, it's not 3.1, it's the amount of that has been used toward personnel and benefits. Those are the ones that people, right? And last I checked, about 35% of what's been spent up until that point has been spent on personnel and benefits. That's the part. So $1.2 billion possibly in personnel and benefits. 1 to 1.2.
Do you have any recommendation on how we can send the word that we're not going to be able to fill that gap when that federal money dries up?
Well, you've had language in your budget for the past 3 years that pretty much signaled, hey, we have no intention of doing that, right? Now, you didn't have any control over their direct use and what they could do with the money. That was all driven by the U.S. Department of Education. You asked them to use it on one-time things. They probably ran out of one-time. Look, I'm not saying they shouldn't have spent it on personnel and benefits, but you have language in your budget that encourages them not to do that, and includes language that we don't intend to support the entirety of those when the money runs out. And again, that's your policy decision. When it comes time to writing the budget, you'll have the request. You just will have to do with it whatever you can do with it.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fulford, I'm always pleased and impressed with your just straightforward analysis and just telling us like it is, and I appreciate that. I was, however, very disappointed in your whole presentation because you didn't use the economic term sugar high.
Oh, you like that?
But if we go back, I'm saying 2 to 3 years ago, you told us what was going to happen, and it has exactly followed that track, and we're on the downhill side of that track, not at the bottom, but it's peaked and we're headed down. So I appreciate that guidance over the years and helping us to see, because obviously you study this on a daily basis, and we don't, but that's very, very helpful, and I appreciate that. So one question. I know the interest on deposits in the general fund is significant, especially with the higher rates now, and those will be tailing off, and you're telling us that now, so I appreciate that. How significant is it on the education budget side? Just from the monies that are there, the A&T fund, the different funds, when you pull all that together, certainly there should be some interest on those.
Yeah, you're right, going to throw something at me. Yes, a lot of that actually, the interest earning on most of that, or a lot of that, goes to the general fund, so it's part of that. Now the reserve fund is separate and it gets to retain its interest, but the budget itself goes to the general fund. That's nothing that anybody did. That's just historically what's happened. All money in state treasury that earns interest goes to the general fund unless you tell it otherwise. And there have been bills that have passed for doing various things that have created a fund and said, and the interest is retained here. But absent that kind of language, all the interest goes to the general fund.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator, we got Senator Coleman Madison, and then Mr. Poole's going to need to come on at 10:15, and if we can hold it, Senator Singleton. Okay, Senator Coleman Madison, you'll have the last question, and I think Representative Garrett has some comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will be brief. It's a follow-up on the question that you asked about the loss of federal funding. And I know that we are looking at where we are as far as anticipated legislation relative to education. And of course, as I try to follow national trends, it looks like the trend is to try to push things down to the state level relative to education. And so I'm just wondering, have you run the numbers relative to the possibility of things that we might pass and how it's going to impact the budget? One of the things that you mentioned was about the COVID, not COVID funding, but opioid settlement money. And I know that mental health had mentioned that good news, they're using part of that money. Of course, that may not be available, and how long will these funds be available? So I'm just asking, have you all forecasted that out, looking at anticipated legislation that may come on and become law?
Yeah, I'm not sure which education legislation you're referring to, but in terms of the opioid monies, we actually went over and met with the AG yesterday to try to get a better indication of when that money is expected to come in over the next few years. So when you're trying to do a supplemental appropriation bill, you'll know how much money you've got in the bank and what you think you're going to have in the next little bit, as opposed to, with the tobacco settlement money, there's a portion of that every year that's conditional because you hope it's coming in, but you don't really know it's coming in until after April of every year. So yes, that's part of, and they're supposed to be coming up with a plan on how to allocate the opioid money. As far as education investments, I haven't seen any proposals so far.
Okay, let me be specific. I was clearly mentioning the legislation that we anticipate coming is relative to school choice and those types of things, how this is going to impact, because it's one pot of money.
Mm-hmm. So I have not seen the legislation, so I can't speak directly to what is or isn't included in it. I will say this, if it's just one of the things that you intend to spend education money on, it's just something that you spend your $9.3 billion on. You got $550 million in new money to spend. Is that where it comes from, or do you do something else? You fund it on the backside. Again, all of that, I'd have to wait to see what the bill actually says and how we go about funding it to have a better idea of what that's going to do.
Mr. Fulford, real quickly, there was my recollection, the interest on some of our funds, like the Education Opportunity Fund, that interest stays in the
Yes.
education budget, right?
It stays within that fund.
Yeah, yeah. And then the
And the budget stabilization.
advancement in technology, same thing, correct?
That's right.
Okay. So, Mr. Garrett?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Fulford, for your presentations. You've been very helpful always to the budget process, but certainly we benefit from your wisdom and your expertise and your guidance. I just want to make a couple comments to compliment the legislature and the budget committees for where we are today. You've shown the volatile environment we've been in and where we've landed. I think it's important to note that we are one of the lowest tax collection states per capita. We also have the lowest taxes per capita. We have the lowest property taxes in the United States. We have the second lowest sales tax rate in the United States. Despite all of that, when you look at stress tests, and I know that Moody's and Standard & Poor's and others have done stress tests, we probably are in the mid-teens in terms of our ability to withstand economic downturns, despite the fact that we have volatile collections too. Most states have more stable revenue sources. We're totally dependent on income and property, on income and sales tax, and you've shown how that's vacillated. So I think the fact that we've been very prudent in the budgeting process, anticipating what was coming and not spending everything we had, these numbers, like I said, many states with a lot more resources than we have are very envious of the position we're in. And I think to that point, when you look at the federal money that's going away, I know Chairman Orr early on has been, I remember him years ago saying, be careful, that money will run out. The state can't replace it, and we can't. But I think as we go forward, we've got to be prudent in how we even spend the reserves we've got, because some of the systems, just quite frankly, have used that money. And I'm not criticizing, but they've, for like you mentioned, 35% may be spent is we're not going to be replaced. So we're going to have to kind of work through that. But I just want to say that I think the approach has been to be very prudent, forward-looking, and not put the state in jeopardy. And I think we've done that. And I want to appreciate commend you for your help in helping us get to that point.
Thank you. You've done a good job. Thank you.
All right, thank you much, Mr. Fulford. Director Poole is in the house somewhere. Come Lord. Everybody should have received the presentation of his slides in paper form.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Welcome back to town, and a pleasure to be with you this morning. Well, as usual, Kirk's a tough act to follow as it relates to this presentation, because he and his team, Shonda, Dustin, do an excellent job of summarizing the financial condition of the state. We're looking at the same numbers, the same statistics, the same indicators in EBO, and so I've attempted in my presentation not today to be completely redundant. I will probably touch on a few of the same points. I've tried to gloss over a few of those, anticipating Kirk's presentation, and I may add some context to a few. But I'm going to talk about a few economic indicators, a couple of brief comments on budget process, and then I'll address general fund highlights and matters, and then close with ETF. But from an economic standpoint, Kirk's touched on a variety of the economic indicators. We know that Alabama's economy right now remains resilient and strong. We continue to enjoy very low unemployment rates in the state, and we're outperforming the national average in this regard. I think this is an interesting graph as we think about our pursuit of full employment, for lack of a better word, in the state of Alabama relative to the job growth that has been created and is being enjoyed in our state. We have a good problem to have. We have more jobs than people. The opposite of that problem is not the problem that you want to have. And so, but we do have challenges. In this graph, you can see going back before the Great Recession, Alabama was outperforming the nation on its unemployment rates. During the Great Recession period, we underperformed the national average. But since that time, you can see a steady march forward for our state as it relates to unemployment, all the way down to just prior to the pandemic. We were outperforming the national average, but we outperformed the nation through the pandemic and beyond the pandemic. And I think that's a great credit to the leadership of the legislature and the governor as we think about post-pandemic issues related to our workforce. Of course, everybody is focused on labor participation rate, so I don't think that there's a lot that I can add to that discussion in this presentation other than to note, when we have so few people claiming and seeking unemployment, we have a large population in our state that is capable and able-bodied that is not seeking employment. And I think we still need to continue to talk about who are they, where are they, and what are the reasons that they're sitting on the sidelines so that we can fill the jobs across our state that are in such demand. Just a multi-year look at the state's GDP relative to national averages. We perform close to the national average throughout. I think that chart speaks for itself, but certainly if we can push the workforce participation numbers up, I would think that our productivity in the state increases and GDP indicators could certainly follow that as well. But economic and job growth during the period of the Ivey administration has been remarkable. That's in large part due to the governor's leadership and the investments made and the wise budget decisions of the legislature. But over this period of time, $47.2 billion of investment and created over $84,000 jobs. So that continues to benefit our state and our citizens as we think about not only the health of our economy and household budgets, but certainly also the state's budgets as well. So just a couple comments on the timing of the budget processes. Of course, the fiscal year in the state of Alabama ends at September. So in September, LFO, LSA, and the Executive Budget Office are well into thinking about revenue estimates. The fiscal year turns, the executive branch closes the books on the fiscal year, an interesting time, zeroes the accounts, and reopens for the new year. That begins in earnest, obviously, during the period of that turn of the fiscal years. Agency budgets are due to be filed by November 1st. Then from that period forward, it is a race in the Executive Budget Office and the Finance Director's Office to meet with cabinet officials, to meet with agencies, review their budget requests, consider what their priorities are, determine what the governor's priorities are going to be relative to budget capacities, which the agencies don't really have privy to in terms of what capacity is available to address needs. And so synthesizing that into a budget recommendation is a long and arduous process, but that process brings us to where we stand today. So we're now in that moment of preparing to present the governor's proposed budgets to the legislature and are excited to do that. Moving into the budgets just a little bit, Kirk outlined kind of the performance of the various revenue sources into the general fund. I'm not going to try to run back through that other than to make the point the general fund, in contrast to the ETF, has a very large, multiple, and diverse set of revenue sources upon which it relies. I took a shot at a little different presentation on where that money goes. This pie chart, we typically present this on an agency by agency basis, but here we've broken it into general areas, so health services generally, criminal justice generally. And of course, it doesn't deviate from the allocation substantially when you think about them on an agency by agency basis. But you see almost 3/4 of the budget in the general fund devoted to health services and criminal justice in the state of Alabama. I am going to highlight two of the revenue sources for the general fund, and of course the big one being the interest on state deposits, and I'm going to mention that as well because Kirk has rightly signaled that as a significant issue and a concern going forward. But the growth of the sellers or simplified sellers use tax certainly has generated growth revenue into the general fund that has benefited our ability in the state to pay for mental health services, DHR, corrections, Medicaid, so on and so forth. You can see that growth trajectory of the simplified seller's use tax. I think that was a wise decision that the legislature made a number of years ago to shift 75% of that tax to the general fund. Interest on state deposits, that's benefiting the general fund. Kirk has run through that. I'm not going to beat that horse to death other than to say I agree with everything Kirk says in terms of it's a complete anomaly, and the sugar high maybe is about to end, Senator Chambliss. I can check that box. But there's a secondary driver of this. It is not only the fact that rates are up, but typically when the state holds federal funds, the federal government does not allow you to retain the interest earnings on that. Basis being the feds don't want you to sit on the federal money, they want you to deploy. They waived that and accepted that as it relates to ARPA funds. So not only are rates up, we are holding substantially more, have over this particular period, more funds in the Treasury by virtue of the ARPA funds, which has further fueled the growth. Now, we're still holding a fair amount of ARPA funds in the Treasury because some of the programs, while they've been awarded, they haven't paid out, specifically broadband, water, and sewer. So as rates go down and as those funds draw down, we certainly going to see those corrections as it relates to that revenue source. And it is a significant cautionary note to the legislature to be cautious in terms of appropriations as we think about that aspect of revenue support. This is a multi-year look at the general fund gross revenues versus appropriations. And what I really want to show here is we have enjoyed a period of pretty substantial growth, to some degree relatively unprecedented in the general fund. But if you look at that 23-24, and as you have an opportunity to think about the 25 revenue projections that are being certified, you're going to see the flattening now. So that is inevitable and is starting to happen in the general fund. We'll review that in the same slide as it relates to the education budget. The governor's proposed budget is going to propose appropriating approximately $3.3 billion out of the general fund. That's going to be an 8.16% increase over the current fiscal year. Look forward to transmitting those budget proposals over, have those filed in the legislature so everybody can look at those in detail. Priorities in the governor's proposed general fund budget are going to be certainly not outside of the norm as it relates to your typical general fund investments. Targeting sustainable agency operational increases, sustainable being the key word for the reasons we've highlighted, Kirk and I both this morning. Targeting a couple one-time capital needs across agencies, addressing state employee compensation, addressing Medicaid. There's, as Kirk indicated, Medicaid costs increase. Those are not expansionary relative to services. They're simply the cost of the program. Corrections has demands, both from an operational aspect. Kirk cited the state health contract for corrections. The costs of that are increasing. I will note that the prison census is increasing fairly sharply. So as the prison census increase, costs will certainly increase as well, inclusive of the health care contract. But of course, we're building 2 prisons in the state of Alabama, and the costs of that have increased as well. So corrections is a major component of the governor's proposed budget. Investments in mental health, law enforcement, economic development, site development funds. Kirk mentioned the SEIB rate, the current rate of $977 versus the request of the SEI board. That's going to be an issue that everybody's going to have to sort out. And then the unified judicial system, the legislature approved, I think it is 4 additional circuit judges and 3 district judges. So the governor's proposed general fund budget will propose funding to support those additional judgeships, which I might add are, in my opinion, are certainly needed across the state and will probably need to continue to look at on the legislature as it relates to demand and need. The education trust fund revenue sources, by comparison to the general fund revenue sources, they're much narrower, but it boils down substantially to income and sales tax. As I think most of you are aware, 25% of the simplified seller's use tax does benefit the general fund, but income and sales tax are certainly the drivers of the education budget. Kirk presented where the education money goes. This is a little bit of a different format, but the same information that backs it up, indicating the differences between the K-12 investment, 4-year, 2 years, pre-K, and other. This is just a snapshot of growth of the simplified seller's use tax as it relates to the Education Trust Fund. Of course, this effectively mirrors the growth in the general fund, this being 25% of those proceeds, the general fund enjoying 75% of those proceeds. Here again is the similar multi-year comparison, total revenues versus appropriations. Again, if you look at 24, you start to see, if you go back to 19, you see the growth of both revenues and appropriations, but then you start to see the flattening in 2024. We anticipate what I would say is a return to normal growth patterns in the ETF. So those are going to feel like reductions, but the truth is we can't sustain, we've talked about that for years, the 20% plus year-over-year growth in the education budget. That historically has been 3 to 4%, sometimes 4.5%. I think we're going to start finding our way working back into more of those traditional growth patterns. The Rolling Reserve Act, Kirk's presentation here again, not surprisingly, also addresses the Rolling Reserve Act. I've gotten lots of questions from lots of stakeholders about the Rolling Reserve Act and the modifications that have occurred. I'm not going to review those, but I did want a summary that's been prepared by my office on those, on this slide and on the public domain for everybody's review to the extent it benefits. But I think Kirk's presentation certainly breaks these out as well. So I think those that need a refresher on the Rolling Reserve Act can refer to either of those presentations. So the Education Trust Fund budget, the governor's budget, from a direct appropriation standpoint, not inclusive of A&T in this number or supplementals or any other expenditures, will propose to appropriate $9.35 billion for education for FY25. That's a 6.25% increase year over year. Priorities that you will see in that budget package will include funding for education savings accounts, K-12 school security funds, K-12 device replacement and recycling matching grant funds, additional funds for turnaround schools. That's been a big effort of the governor. She's traveled the state to focus on several identified turnaround schools. That program has had success, increasing funding modestly for that, but also thinking about a next cohort, maybe in the next year or two, to bring into that program. Targeting K-12 funding, particularly on the Numeracy Act, Literacy Act, after school and summer learning programs, and as much as we can push into OCE for the benefit and flexibility of our school systems, but certainly making an effort to fully fund literacy and numeracy is critical in this governor's budget, and you'll see that reflected in the investments that she proposes. Funds for the State Charter School Commission as it transitions out of being embedded in the State Department of Education into its own existence. One-time investment for the proposed Alabama School of Healthcare Sciences, early childhood education, sustaining pre-K funding. I think everybody's familiar with the success of our pre-K program. Sustaining the quality and the investments in that program is critical. Continuing to focus on sustaining high-quality child care programs. DHR has the QRIS system. They can explain it better than I, but it incentivizes quality for child care. We know we need more child care resources in the state or availability, but it also needs to be quality as a component of that. Additional investments in the community college systems that are certainly warranted, particularly related to dual enrollment in career tech equipment and in education increases across the four-year universities. So, I think, Kirk closed with some cautionary words. I would just say ditto and try not to be completely redundant and say some of the same things. But he points out federal funds are expiring. General fund growth is reliant upon really an anomaly right now. ETF growth returning to normal growth patterns. patterns. So the discipline of managing expectations, recognizing the trends and trajectories, I think the legislature has done a good job of that in recent years, but that's going to be critical because the flattening is underway, and I think not overextending the state relative to its investments is important. Kirk mentions, and I see it across my line all the time, other states that are having big problems. They're running deficits. They overspent during the pandemic. They stood up new programs they can no longer sustain. Federal money is receding, and they're left holding the bag. By contrast, the state of Alabama is in a much stronger position, and I would note that in some of our conversations with the credit rating agencies, there's been a pretty fair amount of conversation with them about Alabama's strengthening of our fundamentals. We are positioning ourselves to be strong on the credit front, and again, that's a testament as they look at the financial health of the state, our long-term obligations, how our budgets are balanced and administered, they key on. So that is a big credit. But I do want to close. I'm glad to answer any questions, but I do want to recognize the Executive Budget Office team. Dorian Carlton leads that team in the Executive Budget Office there in the back of the room with us today. But to suggest that it takes a lot of work to craft the state's complete budgets is an understatement. Her team worked all weekend and into the nights to meet deadlines for your arrival today. So I appreciate their effort, and her team and I are always on standby to assist any of you with any questions, concerns, or information we can provide. We understand that our role is critical to the performance of your duties. We're always prepared to do that. So with that, be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Y'all on schedule.
All right.
All right.
Seeing
you all.
none, thank you, Director Poole. All right, you see this afternoon, our agenda, we pick back up on the education side at 1:30 with Chancellor Baker, and then 2 o'clock, Dr. Purcell, 2:30, Dr. Mackey, and then we'll be finished. So that being said, we are adjourned. Thank you for your attendance.